Thanks for coming. Thanks to the Optimism team. Today I'm going to explain what fully on-chain games are, why I think they're a promising area of development in crypto, and then I'll break your heart and tell you why we can't have them, because they don't scale. I'll try and even tell you how Ethereum's entire roadmap of scaling won't help. And then I'll explain some secret ways which we actually get games to work fully on-chain. And it's going to take some maverick technologists and some creative game designers to work together on this two-sided problem. So this is me. You can follow me on Twitter. I've been a micro-influencer in crypto gaming and fully on-chain gaming now for the past 18 months. But before that, I did a PhD in video game design. I've been thinking about games my whole life and joined crypto in 2017 after reading Mastering Bitcoin and realizing that crypto was actually the most interesting game to study for quite a while. And only until recently has the intersection between crypto and gaming become possible, from my perspective. So what is a fully on-chain game anyway? The premise is that we want to put every meaningful game state change on-chain, trustlessly. So you can't have first-person shooters. We don't have enough transaction throughput for that. You can't have your classic StarCraft map with StarCraft activities because we don't have that kind of speed or reliability. Instead, we have asynchronous options available. This is a picture of Dark Forest. It was the first really interesting fully on-chain game. And the premise behind Dark Forest was that you've got a small planet, it makes some ships. You can send those ships out to take over other planets. Now you've got 2 planets that make ships. You can go take a bigger planet. Now you've got a bigger planet, some smaller planets. Let's go send some ships and take more planets and just expand and explore and exploit and exterminate the universe. This game was played at its peak by about 1,000 players. It took up the entire Gnosis chain that it was running on. I was responsible for sometimes 37 transactions out of 40 on the block as I played this game very aggressively with my DAO. We got so competitive with our opponents that we found ways to bribe miners to not include their competing transactions in the blocks. Censorship became a dominant way to win, and we also realized that fully on-chain games became a great testing site for blockchain vulnerabilities because when you're hurting someone in a game, you're not actually hurting them financially in real life, it's just a game. So the gray hat becomes almost like a white hat in this instance. So why make fully on-chain games? Why was Dark Forest interesting? Well, the first is composability. Since you have this trustless game fully on-chain, you can layer other smart contracts on top. And basically, no one can stop you. And at the same time, you're not cheating or breaking the rules. It's in the same way that you might use a contract on top of Uniswap or a contract on top of Aave. You can't fundamentally break the laws of physics that rule these protocols, but at the same time, you can collaborate with them without ever getting permission from anyone else. And that's, we hope, a very powerful and motivating thing behind this space. They're also financializable. So when we think of Web 2.5 games like Axie Infinity or Steppen, which were massive successes and really interesting projects in their own right, there's always, though, this fundamental issue, which is how much NFT are you going to mint? How much token are you going to mint? Is this truly a scarce asset? And I'm relying on your centralized web server to tell me how many of those things exist and to mint more of them. But if you build your game fully on-chain, you can sort of guarantee to the world, here are all the possible ways you can win, and everyone who wins will get prizes, and no one else will. Right? We have a guaranteed scarcity coming out of this machine that is the game on-chain. And that means speculators can have a better sense of what's going on, and we can also monetize in new and interesting ways at scale. So that's an interesting piece of them. But the #1 reason why people are interested in fully on-chain games, and the #1 reason why there's so much venture capital pouring in, is we frankly don't know what they're good for. We haven't found product market fit, and we think that they're going to be shockingly new and interesting and exciting, and it'll just take some time to figure out why. So here's my personal take on why I think it's exciting. This is the Warcraft 3 map editor. In this map editor, a beautiful game was discovered by a community of players collaborating together. It was called Dota. And Dota got so much traction that it spun off into 20 different games, League of Legends, Dota 2, Smite, Heroes of New Earth, worth billions of dollars in IP, created the largest esports ecosystem, and Blizzard captured almost none of that value. And the people who made that game also captured almost none of that value. Because there wasn't a token to coordinate people, there wasn't an independent registry to take your players with you when they left. And although it was an interesting place to build, it wasn't good enough. Today, Dota looks like this. It's a AAA game with amazing design, lots of great balancing, huge personalities, and a very, really stunning gameplay. But the IP around it really got in the way. And the fact that we couldn't just build with it and that it's all sort of locked behind closed doors made it like a very slow process to go from Dota 1 to Dota 2. And the thought is that, well, if we can build games fully on-chain, we might be able to accelerate that process with permissionless, coordinated play. So what are some examples? You've got Promodium, which is a 4X in space. It's the spiritual successor of Dark Forest. It has some of the best retention in the space. You could play it today at primodium.com. Pirate Nations, which recently announced a $33 million raise from A16Z to build a sort of casual card game and crafting. And so, this one's got the best retention. That one's got the most money. And Shoshin I included because it's got some of the coolest tech, and it'll be an example I'll use later in scaling a 2D fighter. And so, closer up, Promodium looks like this. You're building a base. Every time you place a new piece of your factory, you're getting new resources, you're combining resources to make new resources, build new buildings, then eventually make ships, then go and take those ships and attack other players. And this is a very asynchronous, turn-based sort of passive game that's found some good design techniques. But the problem is that even with a very optimistic view of what a chain could do, 100 TPS, right? And with the sort of bare minimum number of players you could have for a successful game by normal metrics, which is 10,000 concurrent players, Promodium would force people to wait 100 seconds between their moves. That's sort of how the math ends up working out roughly. And that's a really long time between moves for a player. If you're playing a game, you generally expect to make a move every few seconds. And that's going to be something they're just we'll deal with that when it comes, right? We'll try to find product market fit, and then we'll break our chain, and then we'll see how we're going to scale from there. But the difficulty here is what if you designed a game from the start where you knew you were going to run into this problem? What would it start to look like? What would it mean when you have 100,000 players, the desired number, and only 5 seconds between each move, which is a much more desirable number of seconds between moves? Well, you're going to need 20,000 TPS, and we just don't know how to get to that. And so you're going to have to do some really interesting kinds of design. So I think of blockchains as having this really weird shape, where they've got these edges that have affordances. They can give us cool new things, and they've got these sort of crevices, these constraints that stop us from doing cool new things. And some games are going to fit inside this weirdly shaped machine, and some games are not. And the generic scaling approach of just more roll-ups, where we sacrifice composability, or more L1s, where we sacrifice consensus to get more things, or optimizations, where we just get better at making chains, well, the hope is that we grow the shape of this thing. So we don't change what it looks like, right? We just make more of it, and then we'll fit. And this isn't a very specific to game scaling. This is going to benefit everybody to some degree in their own ways. But what I'm trying to think about in this talk, with the time I have, is the specific ways we could scale games that are where they're ready to make sacrifices that maybe DeFi might not be able to. What would it mean if we focused on just working on game-based scaling? And the example I have for you from the Web 2 world is Halo, and then Halo on the Atari 2600. So Ed Fries decided to make a demake. He's the VP of Xbox, basically, and he knew how to program in assembly so that he could basically turn a modern FPS at the time into something that would fit the Atari 2600, which was a console designed to play Pong and Tank. The console itself, in order to have the tech available to make interesting games playable, built in its very firmware the idea of a ball and a paddle and a bullet. And so you can see on this screen here, there's a bullet being shot by that boss, and the paddle isn't present, but the ball is the head of Master Chief here. He had to repurpose the ball just to get a yellow visor, and the way the Atari 2600 works is whatever color the ball is, that's the color the walls have to be. So you can see the wall at the top is the same color as Master Chief's visor. And the constraints of this system are so extreme that you say, well, you could never port Halo to this machine. It was never built for a first-person shooter, and you'd be right. This isn't a first-person shooter. This is a sort of side-scrolling beat-em-up shooter. But that was what's available. And so we need to get creative with using the system we have, which is the EVM, in a way where we can still build fun things and not be sort of beholden or burdened by the current models of what game design look like. So what are some quantitative changes? This is where we go from a game that doesn't fit, and instead of demanding that the space get bigger, let's make it smaller. So the first one is very obvious. It's more complex games, turn-based strategy. Make people think longer between their moves, right? Think chess, right? Think Civilization, slow, brooding games. No hypermobile, fast-style Candy Crush games. Larger actions. Think about doing lots of things before settling to chain. So I'm going to make many complicated different moves all together and then push a batch of moves. This is another way people have thought about scaling games. Or include non-state changing activities. So a good example, if you've played Among Us or Werewolf or Mafia, is games where you get to accuse people of being the bad guy. Every accusation, every negotiation, every diplomatic move, these are all things that happen at a human social substrate above the game that doesn't need to be recorded to chain, and you can still have something pretty fun. And so people are kind of thinking of ways to make games fit by scaling the game down, right? Take less space. But there's a whole other set of strategies. This was meant to come in one at a time and not overwhelm you, I'm sorry. Where you can get creative with how you scale. Where you make sacrifices that people weren't expecting. So out of the box, games on chain were supposed to be massively multiplayer, right? Everybody was going to touch the same state, just like we do in DeFi. But actually, if you make the sacrifice from multiplayer to single player, you can get unlimited scaling by having games just play and roll in sort of ZK circuits. So the sentiment you might have is, okay, I'm going to program my entire game's math in a circuit. And every time a player moves, they're going to prove the move was valid. And when they're done moving, which could be 10,000 moves later, they'll just aggregate all their proofs into one difference proof, push that to chain, chain validates the moves, good to go. We've got massive TPS benefits, but this only works for single player and co-op. Because as soon as people are antagonistically trying to change the order of moves or dispute moves, you get into all these problems with coordination and who's being a bad guy and who's being not live, et cetera. And that's when you end up with two-player games. And from there, although I don't have an example for them, well, because it's in red, and I have examples for the green ones, you'll see that there's a issue where the Lightning Network on Bitcoin, which has these state channels where people can trade currency back and forth at almost unlimited speed, have to have these complex exit games where you can prove to the system that your player that you're playing with has not been polite, has tried to cheat you, and then you'll have to be able to have a dispute system on chain, similar to an optimistic rollup. And so there are probably ways to get really fast two-player games. No one's built the architecture for them. And that's part of the reason for this talk, is to tell you that if we think about not massively multiplayer games, but single or two-player games, there's new tech stacks available that no one's building because they don't suit DeFi, but at some point they might suit games and have fully on-chain games be quite interesting. And then for multiplayer, there's still this idea that we can start downgrading the quality of our data availability layer. We don't need to commit all state to Ethereum mainnet. We can just leverage things like Celestia DA or what Arbitrum has been doing with its collection of consortium of people that just hold the data and promise they won't lose it. Because the cost of losing your history of game data is nowhere near as big as the cost of losing your history of DeFi data. And so it can be totally fine to sort of truncate and stop it. So here the idea is instead of changing the shape of the game, we change the shape of the machine. And we can do that because we no longer need to satisfy all partners that are involved in using the blockchain. This is an example of the ZK circuit system I was telling you earlier. This is Shoshin. It's a fighter game. In it, you basically plot out all the logic that your fighter would ever do. If your opponent is that far away and you're at this health, I want you to slash or walk forward. Or if your opponent is over here and doing this and at that health and you have this much booster, then I want you to do this. And this sort of set of actions a player pushes, and then it automatically bots through. And then the game just pushes one sort of final proof of what your combat would have looked like given these decision-making properties of your character. Right? And so the game trustlessly runs, but with no interactivity. Interactivity is addable, but it's not something that they did. This is Pirate Nation, the game I mentioned earlier that had raised massive amount of money from A16Z. It's a sort of like card game where you use different abilities to shoot the other ship. And then when you're done, you go back to this main map that's behind here. And the main map has a bunch of crafting and progression loops. And all of this is done on Arbitrum Nova, and they've decided to sacrifice the data availability layer, which we were talking about earlier. So yeah, this is my talk. My hope, again, was that you would get excited about fully on-chain games, realize there's lots of deep tech to build to scale them, specifically towards games, but also get excited about them generally as the future of maybe why we use blockchains in the first place. Thank you. Great. I don't see any questions here. We got a question back there. Say it very loud, and I'll repeat your question for everybody else.
Hey, I'm the lead engineer for gaming at Third Web, and we've been actually thinking about these problems a lot recently. And what we found is that in the aggregation version that you mentioned, where you would just stack up a lot of transactions and send them at the end, we found that most games cannot do this because that requires a really linear design. And sometimes the user would want to go to the shop, and that requires a state read, right? So like checking the balance or something. So whenever, would an alternative be like optimistic UI and keeping a state in memory? Like we've seen a lot of issues with on-chain games that are only solved at the blockchain layer, just making everything faster, like the new layer 3 on Arbitrum, Xi, or things like that, where it's less than 3 seconds per transaction. Otherwise, I'm sorry, I rambled on a lot, but I hope you get what I mean.
No, it is really challenging to do the ZK circuit with proof aggregation that rolls up to like one final proof that can be validated on chain.
Yeah.
Only Dojo out of Cairo and the Cairo VM I've seen has been successful in getting that to work, and it's quite a burden. And it's not just a burden on the infra people, but the game designers who don't have the same machine to work with. They're very similar to Ed Freeze's game Halo 2600, where you have to just realize this system doesn't have memory. Like the Atari 2600 doesn't have video RAM. The electron beam needs to know to change color at the exact second that it's shooting as the computer outputs what it needs to do, right? And so that kind of game design needs to be working with the technologists very closely, I think. So yeah, it is hard. I agree with you.
It's going to be a great niche when somebody figures it out.
Yeah, I can't wait.
Right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Question over here from Benji.
Hi, all. Benji. I do NFT things at OP Labs. One of the things with games, and any app really, is distribution. Especially with on-chain games, like as more of them come about, where and who do you see helping tackle that problem the best? What are they doing to help like these games be discovered and distributed? And what could they be doing better?
Sure. So this talk, I focused only on scaling, but let me tell you, there's a lot of other problems with fully on-chain games, including user experience, user onboarding, awareness. So I think Promodium does a good example, and I've recently written a blog post about UX and on-chain games. What they do is they just have a burner wallet for you in the browser, and they don't even tell you you're playing on-chain, and they just let you roll with it. And if ever you wanted to extract your wallet, well, they can do account abstraction and the rest. But there's no rush to do that because we don't actually have a fun on-chain game that has real retention yet. Once you do have one, I think one of the benefits of these kinds of games is you could have a governance token for them. I think that once you realize that this is an open source project that everybody can come into and build with and get exposure to the governance token, and you can give retroactive funding for building on the game with that governance token, you'll have adoption that way. Tokens are the best marketing we ever came up with. So I think that's how you'll get discovery. All right, great. We did our 2 questions. It was lovely chatting to all of you. Thank you so much for attending. Have a great rest of your time at the Optimism Summit.
Return to the Mac. You know what it is, what it does, what it is, what it isn't. Looking for a better way to get up out of bed instead of getting on the internet and checking a new hit.